I think it's a great risk when you first start therapy that you think you must have to tell the therapist everything about yourself. Actually, it's really important to remember that this is your time. You only need to tell them what you want them to know, as and when you want them to know. This is your time to control what is happening for you, and to use wisely, obviously, but do not feel pressurized into saying anything that you do not want to say or are not ready to say. Therapy helped me. I have a dissociative identity disorder, DID. So in many ways, when I entered therapy, life had got very complicated, but I didn't realize that how I was living my life was so different to how other people live their lives. Because you only know how your head works. You don't know how everybody else's head works. So therapy initially caused a lot more chaos in some ways, but at the same time, it always felt that things were going in the right direction. And it just completely, over several years, completely changed my life and gave me a life I never even knew I hadn't had or was missing. So stick with it. If you feel you're with the right person, stick with it, and it can bring about enormous change. I think it's very hard when you decide you want to start therapy. Everybody will have different reasons for starting. For some people, it'll be because you're in a crisis in the moment, and you're offered some what you feel might be really helpful therapy, and that's absolutely the right time for you. For other people, if it's looking at perhaps childhood abuse, it might be that you have got a little bit more say about when you start therapy. You make sure that things are perhaps in place around you. You've got a bit of a support system, and it feels the right time for you. And maybe you found the person you feel you could work with, so that when somebody's going to start therapy is such a personal thing. And I think, again, remember, it's for you. It is not to please other people. So you start therapy when the time is right for you. As somebody with DID, I didn't know some of the things that I was struggling with. There'd been things that I'd always had to manage, and had learned loads of coping techniques and strategies that were just what I did. I didn't realize that they were actually enabling me to lead an ordinary life. But as I got to know and understand more about myself and about my history, I realized how I had always struggled from a very, very small child. I thought everybody lived with trying not to act on suicidal thoughts more or less 24/7. I thought that was just par for the course. I didn't realize that was perhaps not how everybody does live their lives. I didn't, I could work 18 hours a day, which I did, crash out for 5 or 6 hours, straight as soon as my eyes open, back into working. That was just normal for me. I've learned that actually was a total coping strategy. So was it a struggle? I don't know that it was a struggle. It meant I stayed alive, and I had a productive life that felt worth living, even though I had to then go into therapy and sort out so many things. So I think it's much more with hindsight I realised what I was struggling with than actually saying, oh, I'm really struggling with these things in life now, I need some help. It worked really kind of back to front in some ways, and I think for people with DID that can often be the case. With DID, you learn about yourself, and you learn that there are these structures in place to keep you safe. So they are enormous barriers. There were many parts of us who the last thing they ever wanted to do was tell, because they were threatened with not very nice things were going to happen to them if they did. So that is an enormous barrier to starting therapy. But I didn't know that at the time. That was something I learned about as I went on. There are some parts who just want to be private and don't think it's anybody else's business. And there are some parts who just think we're attention seeking and manipulating things and stuff. So those are enormous barriers, but they are an aspect of myself, a part of me, that make life very difficult at times. especially when you're in therapy and you're learning to be more vulnerable, you're learning to let go, you're learning to trust your therapist, all things that put up a red flag of danger immediately for some aspects of yourself. So it's a real, that some of these barriers can be enormous, and just when you think you've overcome most of them, another one will spring up from nowhere, and it'll be another thing you have to work out. But so often these barriers, when you actually look at them, they are again survival mechanisms that were put in place to help you survive. So it's like calling something a barrier that actually kept you alive. So it's a very challenging area to look at. It took me a long while to get to work with a person who was very experienced in working with DID. And then I was in therapy a long while, and so much of that time was ridden with guilt, because I knew there was a lot of people out there who weren't getting any help, let alone long-term help. So it was like, okay, well, look, I've got a lovely family around me, I hold down a job, I do this, I do that. What rights have I got to have therapy? And yet therapy at that time was keeping me alive and helping me just to survive from day to day. But always in the background there was somebody else who deserves this a lot more than I do. Guilt is such a big part of people who've survived a lot of abuse in childhood, I think. So it's guilt from the past, and guilt in the present. But then gradually I learned to say, okay, I am very, very fortunate. I appreciate I'm fortunate. But actually, I'm going to use this as wisely as I can and let guilt go, because guilt is such a corrosive, negative thing that can just eat away at you, and actually very non-productive. So it's learning over the years that life isn't fair. Some people sadly won't get the help they need, but I was very fortunate and I did. So I really appreciated it. When I first started therapy, I was in a very, very bad place. It was chaotic, and that stayed the same for quite a few years, as the whole of my, what we call it, internal system began to become less amnesic between parts. So there was very little that worked outside of therapy for me to help make life more stable. The one thing that I was always able to do, and I know a lot of people can't, was I could always go to work, and that was my safety place, that was my structure, that was my stabilization in the day. So that was something that was so important to me. The rest I got through by luck rather than judgment. But gradually, when things began to be less like World War III inside, I could begin to put things in place. I could begin to enjoy going swimming with my children again, going for walks, going for bike rides. I had a lawnmower tractor at the time, because I've got quite a lot of grass to cut. And for the first few years, my lawnmower tractor was probably my best friend, because regardless of weather and time of year, after a difficult therapy session, I'd get that out and drive it round and round the field, and it sort of kind of was my stabilizing thing. So yeah, that was a good friend and helped me at that time. But I think people try and introduce stabilizing techniques perhaps very early on in therapy, when you can't, in a much too big a way that's overwhelming. It's finding the little tiny things that you can do that help, not the big enormous things of starting a new hobby or whatever. And reading is always, I've been lucky, reading has always been a passion for all of my system. And of course we could read books for whichever age, parts that needed some support and perhaps some comfort. So reading has been a real help for the whole of my system. When you're thinking about therapy, there's lots of things that'll be very personal to you, but I was sort of, one or two points I was thinking about was, does it matter the gender of your therapist? For some people that might be really important. And you know, persevere till you find the right one person for you. For other people, you'll think actually it doesn't matter at all, but it needs thinking about. The other thing I think that I found really hard in the early days with one therapist was she lived locally, and if you've got a lot of abuse in your childhood, you're going to likely have some very difficult issues with attachment. So with my therapist living locally, I would see her quite often, and that was such a negative thing. Think about that. Maybe you want to find a therapist who lives 20 minutes away, you know, so you're not bumping into them regularly. It's something that I really feel passionately about. Actually caused me a lot more pain in the early days than it needed to have done. Again, think about why you think now is the time for therapy. If you're not being encouraged to go to it because you're in a total crisis, it might be that things are okay enough, but there's a lot of stuff you really need to sort out, and this is the right time for you. So do it at your pace, do it when you're ready, do it at how you want to do it. This is your life, you lead it, you live it, because in childhood so much was taken from us and we were always the problem. Now we can become the solution for our own situation. It's hard work, but if you find the right person, you know you've got that rapport with that person. You haven't got to be best friends, that's not what therapy is about, but that rapport that you feel you can communicate and there's something between you, an attunement in the room. I used to call it the magic, now I know it's attunement. That'll be the right person for you. And however difficult it got, when I got with the right person, I always knew, however crazy things felt, we were heading in the right direction, and I could hang on to that as a positive.